Hi guys, it's Crystal. I hope you guys are all doing well today and that you're all safe and happy. I feel like I'm a little off center, but I might be a little bit better now. I'm having one of those days today. So if you're new to this channel, my name is Crystal and I do Canadian true crime or true crime with a Canadian twist. Once in a while, I will be talking about different nations. In fact, next week, I'm probably going to be doing an American case, so hopefully you'll stay tuned for that. Thank you for coming in. Hopefully you will like these videos. Hopefully you'll subscribe, you'll stick around and hear what I have to say. You'll share if you want to, you'll hit the notification bell, and hopefully you'll leave me some comments. I do like to see what other people have to think about the cases that we do here. And of course, if you're a returning subscriber, you guys already know how much I love you and how thankful I am that you guys decided to make me a part of your lives. So thank you very much. So today, we're going to get right into it, guys. We're on the last province that we've had to talk about. Last week was part 1 of Jane Hurshman. This week is part 2. So we're still in Nova Scotia right now, guys. Where we last left it, Jane Stafford, she doesn't like being known, or she didn't like being known that way, but just for this purpose right now, we're going to call her Jane Stafford. That's what she was known as in the trial. Her name is Jane Hurshman, but Jane Stafford had just shot her horribly abusive common law husband. He wasn't just abusive to her, he was abusive to their kids. He was abusive to his neighbors, his community, the police officers. He had a legendary hatred of the RCMP. He was a very big town bully, and she had just shot him while he was passed out drunk in the cab of his truck after he had threatened her son's life and their neighbor's life as well. So Jane was acting on autopilot at this point in time. She told Alan, her oldest son, who was not her son with Billy. He was her son with her first husband, Milfy Wynot. She had another son with her first husband, Jamie, as well. You will hear about them later. So she instructed Alan to take the gun, and he and Roger Manthorn, which was Margaret Georgie's new boyfriend, would break the gun down and get rid of it. She also asked him to get her a bag of clothes ready so she could change her clothes. She then got into the cab of the truck, and her first thought was just that she had to get the truck out of there with the mess in it so that Darren didn't see it. So she essentially drove, they said 7 miles, so I'm going to assume it's around 10, 11 kilometers to a place called Satellite Station Road. She also had Alan call her mom and dad, Gladys and Maurice Hurshman, and tell them to meet her there at this point in time. Alan, while Jane was driving, was down at Margaret's trailer. I feel like I always want to call her Marjorie. I'm sorry, guys. It's Margaret. Was down at Margaret's trailer, and he and Roger Manthorn broke the gun down. As far as I know, the gun was like a huge 12-gauge shotgun, so they broke it down, and Alan asked Roger to go with him to get rid of it over the Medway River. To throw it in over the bridge that goes over it. Roger refused to help him do that, so Alan went down and did that, and he went back to the house and cleaned up the side of the house that Billy had been closest to, because there was like blood and gore all over it. So Jane is driving down the road at this point in time. She has Billy's bloody torso leaning up against her the whole time. She had no idea if he was alive or dead. She just wanted him to get out of there so that Darren would not see what had gone on. Darren at this point in time was, I think he would be close to 5 at this point in time. Yeah, he was close to 5 at this point in time. His birthday is May 30th, so he was close to 5 at this point in time. And she drove the whole way, and then she just turned the truck off and left it on the road. I think it was more like at the side of the road, and she walked until Maurice and Gladys came and picked her up. When Maurice and Gladys asked her what was wrong, she told them that she wasn't going to answer any of their questions, basically, just to leave her alone and get her to their house so that she could clean up. So they did that. When Jane was at their house, she exited the vehicle, went to the bathroom, didn't turn any of the lights on or anything because she didn't want Maurice and Gladys to see what she looked like. And then she unpacked the clean clothes that were in the green garbage bag and put all of her clothes as well as the washcloth and the towel she had used to clean herself off with into that as well, bagged it up and brought it home. She went down as soon as because she asked Maurice and Gladys to take the long way around instead of the more direct route to their house. They didn't ask any more questions because she wasn't going to give them any more information, and they dropped her off at a road that connects to her house. So she walked the remainder of the way back to her house, and she went back down to the trailer, and Margaret, Roger, and Alan were there at this point in time, and she told them, quote, "It's all over. I won't have to put up with it anymore. I blew his effing brains out," end quote. She then had Alan burn the green garbage bag with all the soiled materials, as well as her purse, which was in the truck cab with Billy, in the wood stove. Jane worried all night that Billy would be coming back to get her. She did tell Alan at this point in time that she had no idea what was going to happen from this point in time forward. But she could not get it through her head that Billy was dead. She assumed he was going to come walking back through that door at some point in time and probably going through with the threats he had made to kill Margaret, to kill Alan, and probably herself as well. The next morning, they easily found Billy's truck. Now, he had been essentially decapitated at this point in time. Jane did not know that. The whole time she was driving with him, she did not look at him. She knew he was bleeding, but she did not look at him. So police were able to ascertain it was Billy. He has tattoos on his forearms, or he had tattoos on his forearms, and he was a big burly guy. I mean, despite the fact that he didn't have a head, depending on what he was dressed in, or so I should say dependent on what he was dressed in, the tattoos, and he was probably carrying maybe some form of ID on it. They were quickly able to ascertain that the body in the truck was Billy Stafford. They also knew the truck was Billy's. They'd seen the truck many, many times because he'd had many run-ins with the law. So they arrived at the trailer on the 12th, this is March 12th, to tell Jane that Billy was dead, and she fainted. At this point in time, she said, quote, at that moment, I really knew that he couldn't hurt any of us anymore," end quote. She described it as a feeling of relief, which is probably why she fainted. As the day of the 12th wore on, Staff Sergeant Peter Williamson of the RCMP Liverpool Detachment in Nova Scotia decided that it was looking like it was Jane that had probably killed Billy. They knew that she had contacted Beverly Taylor to kill Billy. She had tried to hire him to kill Billy at one point in time. He never had any plans on going through with it. And as far as I know, she was going to pay him out of Billy's life insurance money. I don't know if it was going to be the whole proceeds or just part of it. She had just said that she was going to pay him out of that. So they had left a message for Bev Taylor, who was actually out on the boats at that point in time, to get back to them, call them as soon as he could. Jane herself doesn't remember a lot about what happened in the days after Billy was killed. She was on heavy amounts of Valium at that time, so the days were like just blurry and they ran together. On March 13th at 12:35 a.m., the police came down and took her to the station. Beverly Taylor had called back at this point in time and confirmed the story that Jane had tried to hire him to kill Billy and was going to pay for his services with the life insurance money. Originally, Jane made up a story that the mafia had killed Billy. Billy was known to carry and use large quantities of drugs, so this made the most sense to her. She didn't want to tell anybody what had happened until after she was able to tell Lamont. So she stuck, Lamont is Billy's father. So she stuck with this story until 6:55 a.m. Eventually, they also took pictures of Jane at this point in time. shirtless. I believe she was allowed to wear her bra. They didn't take pictures of the beating she had sustained with a vacuum cleaner hose just a couple days before. It was the left side they wanted to take a picture of because she had a bruise on her shoulder due to the kickback from the shotgun. So they wanted pictures of that, but oddly enough, the pictures never turned out. She repeatedly asked for Lamont. And at 7 a.m., as far as I know, it was around 7 a.m., Lamont was finally brought to her, and she admitted to Lamont that she had killed his son. She wanted to be able to tell Lamont before she told anybody else that she had killed his son. Eventually, after she, sorry, I shouldn't say eventually, right after she told Lamont, she then told the police that yes, she had pulled the trigger and killed Billy Stafford. She didn't implicate Alan, Roger, Margaret, although she didn't have a whole lot to do with it, but she didn't implicate any of them, nor her parents, even though Gladys and Maurice had no idea what she had done anyway. She didn't implicate them in driving her. She didn't implicate Alan at that point in time with breaking down the gun and bringing her the gun anyway, and getting rid of it, nor did she implicate anybody else. She didn't want anybody else involved, so she never told anything about their small roles in what had happened after. Well, I guess Alan had got her the gun before, so she didn't tell anybody about that. Jane was able to hear at this point in time Peter Williamson make a remark to his other officers that went like this, quote, she deserves a medal. She probably saved a couple of our officers' lives. He always had loaded guns. I'm sure sorry guys, would have gone out there one day and he would have shot one of us, end quote. The officers then drove her to the crime scene. This was about 11 a.m. So Jane had been with them for almost 12 hours at this point, so that they could look around the area and she could point things out. They then drove her into Liverpool proper so she could recount the night's events from the starting point until the crime scene. Then they drove her to the bridge so she could tell them where the gun was. Now, Alan was the one that got rid of the gun, so Jane had no idea, so she just pointed to some random spot and said the gun was there. She was not arrested at this point in time, even though they knew she had killed Billy and she had confessed to it. She was allowed to go home. The police had destroyed her house, looking for evidence. It's what they do during searches, guys. And it was the first time that Jane didn't panic. She's a perfectionist. I know what it feels like to be a perfectionist in house cleaning. And she was a perfectionist with house cleaning, but at this point in time, she was so tired that she just crawled up in bed. She had Darren with her, and she then told Darren that his father was dead and that she had killed him. And he said, quote, "I'm glad, Mummy. I'm glad. Are you glad?" End quote. Jane was charged with first-degree murder on March 16th of 1982. She was not arrested or jailed at this point in time. The officers knew that she wouldn't be leaving the area. She was not a flight risk. Jane hired 31-year-old Scottish-born Alan Scottish-born and Canadian-raised, sorry guys, Alan Ferrier. Now I'm going to call him Alan Ferrier. It may also be proper to call him Alan Ferrier, but I know it more as Alan Ferrier, so I'm going to call him that. He actually worked with legal aid, but Jane wanted him on her case. Now, Jane at that point in time made too much money to be part of legal aid, but circumstances changed in a little while and she was able to hire him on. She also went to see a psychiatrist at this point in time. I'm not sure if it was court ordered. I believe it was. She didn't like the psychiatrist. She didn't want to tell him anything. She doesn't really remember much about going to see him other than she left pretty early on. She was also still under heavy doses of Valium at this time. Now, Jane started to make up another story. She was afraid of losing Darren because first-degree murder carries 25 years, automatic 25 years, no parole here in Canada. She was worried about losing her son, Darren. So she said that Alan shot, and Alan would have been 16 at this point in time, that Alan shot Billy Stafford in the midst of an assault on Jane. So Alan had technically shot Billy, protecting his mother, because she claimed Billy was beating her, so Alan shot him. Amazingly enough, she had never told Alan this part of the story. She had never said anything to Alan about this, but the police went and arrested Alan as well. And he agreed with it. He went along with his mom's story because he figured that's what his mom wanted, but he also figured he was helping her as well. So he too, on March 16th, 1982, was charged with first-degree murder. Sorry, guys, I was just making sure. Eventually, she was sent to the Queens County Jail and then moved to the Halifax Correctional Center to await for her trial. Darren was sent to Ontario to live with one of her sisters for the time being. And he was safer there at that point in time. I believe it was her sister Mona that he went to go live with. And no one at the prison, no one at Halifax Correctional Center could believe that shy, quiet, tiny little Jane had killed anybody. That's how unbelievable it was. Police were not satisfied with Jane's new account of what happened, Alan being the killer. It didn't match up with any of the evidence. So she agreed to take a lie detector test for them. Oddly enough, the day that she was going to take the lie detector test, her father, Maurice Hurshman, was given a lie detector test. Now, he passed with flying colors. But when Jane was faced with her failing result in implicating Alan, she immediately went back to her first story and said, no, it was me that pulled the trigger. I'm the one that killed Billy. And she gave the true account once again of what had happened. On March 27th of 1982, both Jane and Alan were released on bond. I'm pretty sure the bond was paid for by Maurice Hurshman. There was an inquiry into what had happened to Billy Stafford in June. And it was at this point in time that all charges against Alan were dropped. They knew he had absolutely nothing to do with shooting Billy, so all charges were dropped. The first-degree murder charge was dropped against him in June of 1982. This was actually June 7th of 1982. Alan Ferrier didn't believe that Jane should be up on first-degree murder charges. He thought they should be manslaughter charges at most. And oddly enough, the Crown and also the police officers did not believe she should be up on first-degree murder. They all thought it should have been manslaughter. However, the provincial, so Nova Scotia's Attorney General, were the ones that filed the first-degree murder charges. They thought Jane should get the first-degree murder charges because Billy was not in the process of attacking her when she killed him. He was asleep in the truck cab, or passed out in the truck cab. So they made it the first-degree murder charges. If you guys remember self-defense in 1982, you had to only use enough force necessary to get rid of, or to stop the harm that the person you were using the force against was committing on you. They had to be in the process of committing an act on you at the time that you killed them or used self-defense. Jane's trial started November 2nd of 1982, and it was an 18-day trial. The court was always filled to capacity. By now, this had made national news, so there was a lot of news reporters and media outside waiting to see Jane, as well as the community. The community was actually supportive of Jane. They stood behind Jane because they knew exactly what Billy Stafford had been like. They knew about abuses. They knew about his bullying. And to some extent, they were not unhappy that Billy Stafford was dead. So she also had the support of not just Canada, but also the community that she lived in as well. She had, quote, become a national symbol in the struggle against male oppression and spousal abuse, end quote, at this point in time, because media was now able to talk about spousal abuse and the effects on spousal abuse. I can't talk again today, guys. I'm sorry. The effects of spousal abuse because of Jane's case. Prior to that, everything was hidden. It was only talked about in small spurts and only within the feminist movement. It was not really talked about that often. Jane's case forced spousal abuse out into the public eye, and people were outraged when they heard what she went through. So she had the support of the nation as well. Jane had been a really private person up to this point, and she'd also been isolated in both of her marriages, really, and most of her life she had been an isolated private person. So this was very intimidating to her to have so many community members and the media and reporters and everybody asking for comments, even though Alan Ferrier told her to say no comment or would tell them no comment on behalf of Jane. But this is very intimidating for her. She was also intimidated by the trial itself. She was a nervous wreck at this point in time. She was scared. She had no idea what was going to happen. She didn't want to spend 25 years behind bars. I don't think any of us would want to, but she was very terrified. And she was also terrified of having to tell people what had gone on in graphic detail, what had happened in her marriage to Billy. She knew she would have to bring those things up. The Crown was represented by Blaine Allaby. His job was to convince the jury that Jane had no right to kill Billy just because he had abused her. Essentially, he had to prove that the murder was premeditated and deliberate beyond a reasonable doubt, which, you know, in Canada, you have to, in federal court cases, you have to present your evidence and come up with the jury has to come up with a unanimous vote beyond a reasonable doubt. Jane's first confession was actually thrown out. Judge Burchell, did not allow it to be used, the one that she gave Lamont, because when Peter Williamson wrote it down, he didn't include any of the abuse that Jane had went through. He didn't think he should, or that it had any impact on what Jane had done, because he was not abusing her at that point in time. Allaby used both, of course, Beverly Taylor and who had talked about Jane trying to hire him to kill Billy, and paying him through the life insurance policy. He used Bev Taylor as one of his witnesses. He also called Ronald Wambolt, who had lived with the family at that point in time. Ronnie was an alcoholic, but he had also been highly abused by Billy during the time too. Now he couldn't remember everything because of he was an admitted alcoholic too. Because of his alcoholism, he couldn't remember everything. He blacked out a lot, but he could recount times that Billy had abused Jane, Darren, himself, Alan, other people that he knew. He was able to recount that. And what else is amazing is that he was actually able to stay sober from when Jane had killed Billy until the trial. So he had more of a clear mind at this point in time. He was actually beneficial to the defense's case by being able to recount all of the past abuses. And he also talked about Jane's character too, how she was a good mom, how she kept the house clean, how she was a good cook, and she seemed like a good person. The Crown also called Alan to come and take the stand. He also bolstered Jane's case. He talked about the abuse and how he told them about how he had gotten rid of the gun. He also testified that Jane had not asked him to cover for her and say that it was him that had shot Billy while Billy was abusing his mother. He had never talked to Jane about that. She had never tried to coach him in that. He just agreed to do it because he thought he was helping his mother, and it's what his mother wanted. He also testified that Margaret Georgery had kept a gun, on her kitchen table and a bullet underneath of her pillow. I don't know why she would keep them so far apart, but anyway. When he asked her why she did this, she said, quote, If that fool, meaning Billy, even comes down here causing trouble, he won't be walking back, end quote. Most of the evidence given by Crown witnesses told of the horrible abuses that Jane, Darren, everybody in the family had suffered, and the community at large. They also had Gladys and Maurice take the stand as well, and technically backfired on them because they also talked about how Billy abused them as well. Now, oddly enough, Margaret Georgery took the stand for the Crown. In it, she downplayed all the abuses. In her testimony, she downplayed the abuse, and she downplayed everything that had gone on with Jane. She also downplayed her feelings about Billy. She claimed that her feelings were no longer the same about Jane, and it seemed, she said that Jane was pretty much just a complainer who made things up. I don't know why Margaret turned against her. This woman had been like a second mother to Jane, and she just decided that she was going to say all this horrible stuff about Jane, and to make Billy almost seem like, in her testimony, almost seem like an all right guy, that she didn't have any beef with him, even though he was threatening to tell people that take away her land because she and her common law husband Stan hadn't been married. He died without a will. So she somehow thought that the land that she lived on would be taken away from her. This is the reason why most people gave for why Margaret turned against her. She didn't really give a reason. The reason most people believe is that she was afraid that somehow her land would be taken from her. And it also may have had to do with her animosity towards the law. Peter Williamson was also called in by the Crown. So were Jane's parents. Like I said, Peter Williamson also painted a very vivid picture of what an abusive bully Billy was. And he also testified to making that comment, not to Jane, but to the other officers, that Jane deserved a medal. He also testified to it. He said he did do it. Gladys was also a witness for the defense. She was hostile at first with the Crown. She didn't want to disclose the abuse she had gone through with Maurice, thinking that it would have a detrimental effect on her marriage now, because her marriage was better. If you'll remember, Maurice had stopped abusing her and had also stopped abusing alcohol at this point in time. So she did become a witness for the defense, and she also told the defense about the abuse that had happened to her and that her kids had witnessed during most of their childhood. Then it was Jane's turn to take the stand. And Jane is a very timid, quiet little lady. She was very scared. Sorry, guys, I have to let my dog in. She was very scared of giving her testimony at this point in time. And she had to be told to speak up during points in time in her testimony. But she was able to do it. She came through, and she was an awesome witness for herself. She talked about all the abuses, all of everything he'd done, the physical abuse, the mental abuse, the emotional abuse, the sexual abuse, every horrible thing that Billy had done to her, Billy had done to her sons, Billy had done to her parents, Billy had done to the community, Billy had done to Ronnie, Billy had done to the animals. She was able to describe those abuses, and she was a very, very good witness. Despite the fact that she was a nervous threat, or a nervous wreck, I don't know why I wanted to say threat, a nervous wreck at this point in time, she was able to get through her testimony. Alan Ferrier asked her at one point in time what she did about the abuse. And she said, quote, "I just carried on about my business. He would tell me it was my fault anyway. Whenever I did get a beating, he would always tell me it was my fault. I was the one who started it. You hear it so much, after a while, you begin to believe it," end quote. Jane did disclose that she had tried to hire Beverly Taylor to kill Billy. She also disclosed that she had tried to get one of Billy's daughters from his marriage to Pauline, one of the ones that was living in Ontario, to send her chemicals so she could also get rid of Billy. So I know what you guys are thinking. It does seem premeditated. But Jane had not wanted to kill Billy herself until the night it happened. She had no inclination to do that. She just wanted him dead. That's why she tried to hire somebody to do it. She also talked about implicating Alan as the shooter out of fear that she would end up in prison for 25 years and she wouldn't know what would happen to Darren. She said she did not tell Alan about it and she didn't consider what consequences there might be for Alan at that point in time. She just didn't want Darren to have to be alone. Jane also testified that she had no idea that there was an abused women's shelter in Halifax. She had no idea about that. And that she didn't think there was another way out. She thought there was no way out for her. She believed that more people would be dead if Billy Stafford was still alive. He had threatened so many people during his life. He would have either killed Jane. He would have likely killed Jane, her sons, Darren. Oh, sorry guys, it's Lola. Darren, their son together, Ronnie, Margaret, police officers. She believed that more people would be dead if Billy was still alive. She also said that she hadn't planned on killing Billy that night. Hence why she chose to plead not guilty to first-degree murder. She really did not have it in her mind at all until she went to pull the trigger, or until the couple minutes before she pulled the trigger. 3 experts were called in regarding Jane's state of mind. One found her to be extremely depressed, also alluding to her having very low self-esteem and anxiety and internalizing all of her anger, saying, quote, "The stress made her thinking, her way of acting more fuzzy and more illogical," end quote. Another agreed that Jane seemed very nervous and very depressed. She did not seem to have aggressive or violent tendencies. This expert said, quote, "I think she reacts to situations as they come up. I think that she does not look at the consequences. And in this respect, her judgment is limited. It's limited to the effects of her immediate actions," end quote. So that's why I said she really didn't have the foresight to understand implicating Alan and consequences it might have for him. She didn't really have a lot of foresight or a lot of planning into what she had done. She just pulled the trigger, knew she had to get his body out of there before Darren saw it, knew that they had to get rid of the gun, and knew that she had to clean herself up. She wasn't really planning. She was just reacting to the situation as it came up. The third person had also interviewed Darren and was able to disclose about things he had seen in Darren and things that Darren had said. At one point in time, Darren had drawn a picture of himself like really big and Billy really small. And he was like very happy with the picture. And he said that he basically wished that he was the big person and his dad was really small so he could yell and hit at him in roundabout terms. This doctor said he wasn't surprised to hear that Jane didn't know about the women's shelters in Halifax or any resources that were available to abused women. I mean, most of it was underground at that point in time, and most of the shelters would be in larger cities, not in smaller communities. They weren't really talked about. They weren't really advertised. So he said that it made sense that Jane didn't know. And he said, quote, "These institutions are underfunded and overcrowded," end quote. He claimed that Jane, having saw Gladys be abused and endure abuse and survived it, may have made Jane think that she could do the same thing, may have made Jane think that Billy would eventually stop drinking, Billy would eventually stop abusing her, because she had saw that happen with her parents, if she had stuck it out and stayed with the marriage. Of course, they also brought Pauline Stafford and Faith Hatt, Billy's 2 previous relationships. One was his ex-wife, one was his ex-common law partner, come into the courtroom and explain what Billy had done to them. The Crown did not want this to happen. They objected to it and they asked that it not be allowed. However, Justice Burchell allowed it, and he stated, quote, "The purpose of that evidence is to show that it was the habit of Mr. Stafford to abuse women with whom he had such a relationship," end quote. Never before had this been allowed in a courtroom during testimony for self-defense or during testimony about abused women. At that time, like I said before, self-defense could only be used during the actual commission of violence, during the actual process of being harmed by someone. Self-defense was usually used like if somebody had broken into your house, if you gotten into a bar fight and this person was coming at you, or you were out somewhere, you got into an altercation, this person's coming at you with a knife, a baseball bat, a gun. You then react immediately. They're going to kill you, so you get rid of the threat first. One could also only use enough force necessary to get rid of the harm that was going to be occurring at the time. And self-defense had to be used during the commission of violence, during the process of violence on your person at this point in time in 1982, in November of 1982. Jane's case, of course, helped change that, and we're going to get into that. Now, Alan Ferrier, himself thought that Jane's best hope was to get manslaughter. At best, it was not a premeditated thing. Even though she had wanted to hire people to kill Billy, she had not premeditated killing the act herself. She had not at any point in time thought about shooting and killing Billy. She wanted somebody else to get rid of him, but she had never thought about that herself. And it was obviously not very well thought out. Blair Allaby argued that Jane hated Billy and that she wanted to be rid of him. He pointed out she tried to hire Bev Taylor and also one of Billy's daughters to help her do this. He said, and because of this, it was therefore a planned murder, so therefore it was premeditated. He said, quote, "We may sympathize with Jane Stafford in her situation, but the law is the law," end quote. On November 20th of 1982, Jane Hurshman was found not guilty of the murder of Billy Stafford. She was free to go home. This was a groundbreaking case, guys. Groundbreaking case. It was the first time the battered wife syndrome or battered woman syndrome had been allowed as a defense. An amendment to self-defense had been allowed and accepted as a defense in a first-degree murder case. This helped actually change Canadian laws as they applied to abused women and who killed their abusers. I know, it's a lot of work today, guys. It's 23 pages. It's very hard for me to memorize everything, guys. The Nova Scotia Supreme Court did actually order a new trial later on, though. Of course, the Crown immediately appealed the decision and saying that the evidence of Billy Stafford's brutality and abuse against Jane should never have been allowed into the courtroom because Billy was not on trial, Jane was. And the appeals court also rejected Jane's self-defense plea as Billy was asleep in the truck at the time that she shot him and not actively abusing her, not in the process of causing her harm. Now, he was not a threat to Jane, basically, at that point in time. Now, during this time, Jane was actually living in Ontario. She had gone to her sister Mona's house where Darren was. She thought she was free to go, even though Alan Ferrier had actually warned her there probably would be an appeal, so to be available. So Jane had actually gone to Ontario, but she wanted to go back to Nova Scotia. She didn't feel comfortable in Ontario. It wasn't home. So she actually went back to Nova Scotia and she started taking nursing courses at this point in time. Now, rather than going through the ordeal of a trial again, Jane actually pled guilty to manslaughter on February 14th of 1984. So it was almost 2 years after Billy had died. She didn't want to go through that again. She didn't want to put other people through it again. She didn't want to have to testify again about what had happened to her. So she agreed to plead guilty. Jane was sentenced to 6 months at this point in time. She would be out in 2 months, guys, because you only serve a third of your sentence before you're able to apply for parole. And she would have to do 2 years of probation at this point in time. So she was once again sent to the Halifax Correctional Center. Meanwhile, changes in Canada were being made at this point in time. The government was starting to allot more money for shelters and transition houses to be funded, but also to be built. The legal system was also starting to change. They wanted spousal abuse and abusers to be more cracked down on before. Remember, in the first video, I told you guys it was a very low priority in the court system. It wasn't prosecuted very often, and even when it was, the charges didn't really stick, and the probation, the fines, the conditional sentences, the absolute discharges, so on and so forth, weren't really put into play. Like they were never made to do any of these things. It almost seems like these were just cursory. So, but at this point in time, a message came down from our attorney, Canada's Attorney General at the time, office urging police and Crown prosecutors to crack down on wife beaters, end quote. Sorry, I meant to say quote. And there is another regard to the law. In 1990, the law was actually changed mostly due to Jane Stafford's case, where battered wife syndrome or battered woman syndrome was allowed to be used as a self-defense. And they could also allow the accused's character, or sorry, not the accused, the deceased's character to be brought into play at this point in time to show what the abuses were like. Before, that wasn't supposed to be allowed. That's why Jane's trial was so groundbreaking, because it did allow it and it did put this out in the public eye. So what happened to Jane and what she did after killing the man who horribly abused her, and so many others, led to the Supreme Court of Canada, like I said, our highest courts. That's our highest court system, guys, in 1990 to rule, quote, that a battered woman should be allowed to use a plea of self-defense for killing her abuser, even if an attack against her was not in progress or imminent, end quote. The courts also ruled that, quote, evidence of battered wife syndrome and evidence of the deceased's character, end quote, were allowed in court in support of this particular part of a self-defense plea. Battered wife syndrome was now an acceptable plea by way of self-defense. And this is all because of Jane Stafford and the trial, Jane Hurshman and the trial. So Jane actually did well at the jail in Halifax and correctional center. The staff was mostly nice to her, so were the other inmates. And she was also allowed to continue her nursing courses. So it would almost be like day release, guys, or like work release, where you're able to leave at one point in time, drive to where you have to be, and then you have to be back to sign in at another point in time. So she was able to go to her courses then. And Jane was actually released on April 14th of 1984 after serving 2 months. So she was released fully, with the 2 years of probation, of course. And Jane set several goals for herself. The first and foremost thing that she did was to get rid of the last name Stafford. For herself and for Darren, she changed their name to Hurshman, her original last name. And she set 4 goals: to seek therapy for herself and for Darren, to reunite her family, meaning getting Alan and her other son Jamie back under her roof, finding a job, and also to help other battered women. And she did graduate in June of 1984 from the nursing program, and she was able to get a job. Now, she often worked nights, guys, because she couldn't sleep very well at night. This is actually a hallmark of severely abused people, having trouble sleeping at night, becoming a bit of an insomniac. So Jane worked night shifts. It was well suited to her. And she began telling her story in speaking engagements and workshops and conferences. She began gaining confidence because of being able to release this. And she spoke many times on the topic of abused women. She sought therapy for herself and for Darren, like I said. And she was able to learn along the way, like I had said in our first video, that basically Jane was primed for this from an early age due to witnessing the victimization of Gladys by her father. Um, it was normalized in her mind. She was eventually reunited with both Alan and her second son, Jamie. They came back and visited her and stayed with her from time to time. Although Jamie mostly lived with Milfy. He'd lived with Milfy for most of his life, so he tended to stay there. Alan went back and forth. He was also getting older at this point in time. In 1984, Alan would have been, 18. So, and she also started to deal with the anger and the resentment she had towards Maurice and Gladys for the way she had grown up, and for the abuses that she had seen. And she was able to heal that relationship. Maurice himself, and we learned this through another one of his daughters, actually apologized for what he had put his wife and kids through, specifically what he had put his kids through. And part of that was because of Jane and seeing what had happened to Jane and knowing how the cycle had gone on in her life as well. Increases were made constantly at this point in time in providing grants for shelters for abused women and kids. A transition house was built in Halifax. I believe it was Halifax. No, a transition house was actually built in Queens County, which is where Bangs Falls in. That's where we're talking about. Bangs Falls, Nova Scotia was where Billy and Jane had lived. So in Queens County, so Liverpool, Bangs Falls, Bridgewater, a transition house was actually built there in 1986. And in 1983, Dalhousie University received a grant to start a program to help sexual abuse victims. And like I said before, the law of self-defense was changed in 1990 to include battered women syndrome as part of the defense of self-defense. It's a lot of defense. Jane herself actually helped many abused women. She gave many talks on radio. She gave many talks on television, at conferences, at workshops, in panels. And of course, she told her story to Brian Valier, who then wrote this book, which is Life with Billy. Once again, if you guys want to read it, it's a really good book. It's not easy to read, but it'll tell you even more about Jane's story than what I can get into. Jane said of this, quote, "There are a lot more Janes out there, too many. When I pulled that trigger, it was too late for me to turn back, but it will never be too late for me to reach out and help others," end quote. And Jane made a lot of advances through her therapy and through her counseling sessions, and also through being able to speak about it. However, she also had a lot of setbacks. Jane suffered from horrible flashbacks. If I were speaking to Jane now, I think at this point in time, if any psychiatrist saw Jane, they would probably be able to diagnose her with PTSD due to the fact that she'd have flashbacks at odd times, and she would basically disassociate. She would be on autopilot. It was like there was nobody home and she was in her mind. Her friends talked about this disassociation. Some of them later on asked her if she thought it was possible that she had multiple personality syndrome or dissociative identity syndrome. Dissociative identity disorder, sorry. There was no definitive proof of that, I guess you could say, guys. There was no actual psychiatrist that diagnosed her with that, but it does seem like PTSD did play a hefty part in Jane's life. But because she told her story so often, she had to relive those memories a lot, so she would have flashbacks. And she also continued to shoplift at this time too, guys. She had actually been shoplifting for a very long time. She was diagnosed with kleptomania, which is an illness. It's a compulsion to steal. Jane did not know why. Sometimes it was for the high of doing it. Sometimes she didn't even remember doing it. Sometimes, and they were like items that she wouldn't necessarily need. She just did it. It was almost an automatic thing. And she did get in trouble with the law quite a few times for this. She usually would start stealing, though. The kleptomania would start occurring at times when she was more heavily stressed out. And she did date, actually. She had dated an older man for a period of time. She had dated another man that was a long-term relationship for a while. They got along very well. These men always were good to Jane, but that relationship didn't last. However, she did take part in a relationship with, I'm going to call him her current partner. He's not, and you'll see why, but her partner at this point in time was several years younger than her, but the two of them did actually get married. They loved each other, and she did get married to this third long-term relationship. Both the second long-term relationship and the third long-term relationship that resulted in marriage, both of these men were worried about Jane and the effects that the speeches she was giving were having on her. They weren't worried that, you know, she was causing trouble for them or anything like that. They were worried about what it was doing to her mentally, and they asked her to stop. And from time to time, Jane would stop for short periods of time, but she always started again because she figured these women needed her, and she knew that these women needed her. Jane helped many women as well by providing one-on-one counseling for their abuse by what had been going on in her marriage. She was able to give one-on-one counseling advice to women, and she saved a lot of lives this way as well. Many of these women were considering suicide, and Jane was able to give them a safe place to talk, especially with somebody who knew what they were going through. So Jane provided a lot of counseling at this point in time as well. She became a board member for the Elizabeth Fry Society in Halifax as well, which this Elizabeth Fry Society, we have them actually all over Canada, helps to improve conditions for incarcerated women. She was also a member of the Solicitor General's Special Committee on provincially incarcerated women during this time too. But like I said, she was still getting into trouble, and she was, a lot of the times they didn't sentence her with anything when she was caught due to the kleptomania. She was caught in November of 1991, and she was to take part in a trial that would start March 4th of 1992. So this time they were going to crack down on Jane. She did not tell her family when she was arrested for shoplifting. This was actually November 16th of 1991. She refused to tell her family. She didn't want to bring any more shame on them. And Alan himself has talked about this, saying that at this point in time, he said he didn't want to hear about it anymore. He didn't want to know about it because he didn't understand that kleptomania was an illness. At that point in time, he just knew his mom stole, and it was embarrassing for him. So he didn't really want to acknowledge it at that point in time. She didn't feel like she could tell her family, so she didn't tell her family. She was secretive like that with the stealing. During this point in time, and throughout a lot of the decade, throughout a lot of time from 1982 until 1991, Jane had talked about suicide. Sometimes the flashbacks and the memories were so bad, she just wanted to commit suicide to get away from them. Sometimes she was so depressed, she would feel suicidal, and she'd discuss this with friends. Her and one friend had a plan. Basically, if the one friend wanted to commit suicide, Jane would help her. And if Jane wanted to commit suicide, the friend would help her. So there were several times where she actually made plans, and she actually wrote out notes. She always had her will handy. She had everything in place, but then she didn't go through with it. She did confess to a friend at the Christmas season of 1991. So, you know, November 16th, she was arrested. This was around Christmas time. So during the Christmas season of 1991, she did confess to a friend that she had actually hired a man to kill her. They had driven out to a specific road, and when he put the gun to her head to kill her, the gun didn't go off. It misfired. So she did confess that she had actually tried to commit suicide. But a lot of her friends noticed that around Christmas time in 1991, Jane was very depressed. She wasn't acting right. She just didn't seem like her normal self. Um, she, sorry, Jane did obtain a gun during the Christmas season of 1991. Her partner at the time that she was married to, um, Joel Corkum actually was his name, didn't know how she obtained the gun. She had talked about it previously. Um, he knew she had hidden it in an attic because he didn't really want it around him. When he went up to look for it at one point in time to make sure that she had gotten rid of it, it was no longer there. And Jane told him, "Oh yeah, I got rid of it." And no one really knows for sure if that's what happened, if she did get rid of it. And she got this gun through illegal means, guys. She didn't have a permit to carry a gun. The story I heard was that she got it from the Hells Angels, or that she was looking to get guns from them. So, like I said, in November and December of 1991, Jane also actually was feeling suicidal, was feeling depressed, but she actually also started receiving threatening letters and phone calls, promising to, quote, shut her up permanently, end quote, if she didn't stop giving speeches and talking about women abuse or abused women. Some people say that the voice on the tapes, because several people heard them, some of the calls came into the Elizabeth Fry Society, so several people heard them. Also, Joel Corkum would have heard them at home as well, and some of her other friends. Some people did say that the voice was definitely male. Some people said it was unidentifiable, including the RCMP. She received another threatening note left on her car in January of 1992, and another threat that was called into the Elizabeth Fry Society. I believe it was the Elizabeth Fry Society in February. So she actually took all the tapes and the notes with her and forced a meeting with the Nova Scotia Deputy Solicitor General so that she could have this filed and be known. She went to the very top. She overstepped everybody else to make sure that the threats and the phone calls would be taken seriously. I don't think she thought that any other detachment would be able to take them as seriously or would want to. Okay, guys. So here's where the other mystery comes up. February 21st, 1992. Jane had been complaining about her car and figured that something needed to be fixed in it, or told Joel Corkum that something needed to be fixed. So she wanted to take his car that day. She had worked, I believe, the night shift the night before, and she needed to go and get a cake for one of the clients at the elderly care facility, or at the facility that she worked at. I believe it was elderly care, but it may have been like an elderly care and special needs facility. She was going to get a cake for a guy whose birthday it was the next day for one of the clients. So she needed to take his car. And of course he allowed her to. She didn't bring her purse, and she didn't bring any ID, which was odd because Jane never went anywhere without her purse. And she didn't come back. Joel called around before eventually notifying the police that Jane was missing. So she went missing the afternoon of February 21st, 1992. The police were able to find her the next day, so February 22nd of 1992, shot to death in what would have been Joel's car at a marina. She was shot in the chest. At that point in time, they didn't know it. She was slumped down. She had like a blanket covering her lap, part of her arm, I believe part of her other arm as well. And it took them a while to find the shotgun blast. It had gone right in through here, and it was very small. They were able to find the gun at the scene. There was a half cup of coffee and some bags in the passenger seat. No purse, no ID, like I said. And in the back seat was the cake, as well as a few other items. Police did actually find a note in her pocket saying, quote, "No more talk from you, gotcha," end quote. And of course, like I said, the gun was actually found in her lap after the blanket, after they had gone to sit her up a little bit more, the blanket kind of fell and they were able to see the barrel of the gun. It was a handgun. And Jane was shot. Now, some people, a lot of people actually believe that Jane committed suicide, either that she hired someone to kill her or that she actively killed herself because she was, number one, shot in the chest, and number two, there was a button for her like camisole almost, and she bypassed that to shoot it in there. Most, if a shooter was going to shoot you, they wouldn't care. If you were going to shoot you, you would kind of care. Oh, that's a little bit awkward, I'm going to do it this way. So they figured Jane, and also from the way she was sitting, like the position she was in the driver's side, it didn't appear that someone could shoot her in the way she was shot. I think she was shot up this angle. Like, someone can't come around to your windshield and shoot you up from that angle, or come around your door and shoot you up from that angle, unless they were basically sitting on top of you. So they believe she either hired someone to do it or that she did it herself. Police officers knew this. A lot of her friends alluded to this. And also the medical examiner himself figured that it was suicide at this point in time. Another reasoning for this is because she had talked about suicide in the past. She had talked about her depression in the past. People noticed she was acting different during this season, that she seemed suicidal. She had already confessed to one friend that she had tried to commit suicide, which would be assisted suicide, that she had tried to commit assisted suicide earlier in the Christmas season. And because 2 days before she went missing, I think it was 2 days before she went missing, she had recorded a new will and testament 2 days before she went missing, guys. And of course, Joel Corkum was able to recover it from her lockbox. Her behavior that winter, of course, like I said, suggested to some friends she was feeling that way. Halifax police also felt it was suicide, as did the medical examiner, and that either Jane did it herself or had hired someone to do it. But still some questions linger. Jane has some friends, there are some reporters, and Maurice and Gladys Hurshman also did not believe that Jane committed suicide. They didn't believe that Jane would ever do that. They thought it had to do with something. It had to do with whoever was leaving the threatening notes and letters. However, I will say that the RCMP was never able to disclude Jane from actually leaving those threats for herself. Maybe setting it up to give herself a reason to commit suicide. However, they've never actually proven who did or didn't do this, so that still remains up in the open. Did Jane send the letters to herself or get someone to? Other people at the Elizabeth Fry Society also received threatening notes and phone calls, though, so I tend to believe somebody really actually was threatening Jane and the other workers at the Elizabeth Fry Society, and as such, it led to Jane's anxiety and depression more, and probably provoked her PTSD, or what I would assume she would have as PTSD. The RCMP, like I said, didn't clear Jane as a possible source for the threats. It's also interesting that she died from a gunshot wound in a vehicle just a couple weeks, maybe 3 weeks, before the anniversary, the 10th anniversary of the death of Billy Stafford. And Jane had also talked to people, telling them about her guilt towards taking Billy's life. If you'll remember, she did have a pretty heavy belief in God, and she felt guilty that she had to take another person's life. She didn't feel guilty that Billy was dead, more or less. She felt guilty that she had to take his life in such a violent way, and that she had to take his life. She didn't feel guilty that he was gone from her life, but she felt guilty that she had killed another human being. So as for what I believe, yes, I do believe that Jane more than likely committed suicide due to the fact that she had left the note, or she had left the new will, that she had taken Joel's car instead of hers, possibly so she could leave that for one of her sons, that she appeared to have gotten all of her affairs in order, that she had spoken with several people about suicide before, that she alluded to feeling depressed, that she alluded to feeling suicidal, and that she had tried to hire a guy to kill her just a little bit before this. So yes, I do believe that she committed suicide. I believe she couldn't take the flashbacks and the memories anymore. I think they were too provoking for her. I think they led her to a backward slide. I think as much as she was helping people with the counseling, and as much as she was helping being on committees and giving talks and doing workshop, I think part of that, because Jane always wanted her privacy back, I think part of that played on her as well. That even though she was a very private person and she wanted her privacy, she felt compelled to help people. So I think part of that had a reason for why she committed suicide. But I think that the biggest reason would be over her guilt over taking another human being's life, and especially the flashbacks, guys. These are brutal, violent flashbacks that she's pulling herself into, and she seems to disassociate after them. And then she goes on stealing sprees as well. These things are coupled with the fact that it was so close to the 10-year anniversary, and the fear from the threats, like I said before, unless, she really did make them herself. I don't think she did, but unless she did, probably led to her taking her life. So what do you guys think? That is Jane's story, guys. That is the end of Jane's story. I wish it had a happier outcome. I wish it had a better ending. I wish, I could tell you things went better for Jane. And in a lot of circumstances they did. But regardless, she still struggled most of her life. And now hopefully Jane has peace, because if anybody deserves it, it's Jane Hurshman. So what do I think? I know you guys are waiting for this. This is the polarizing point. And I want to say that I think of Jane Hurshman as a hero. This case has been in my mind for many, many, many years. I remember my mom reading Life with Billy. I remember watching Life with Billy years ago. And of course, I just rewatched it this summer. I remember reading the book myself many years ago. I remember all of this, hearing about it in law class, all of it. And to me, Jane Stafford is a hero. I know she took someone's life, and I know that we don't have the right to do it. But if she hadn't taken Billy's life, many more people would be dead. Jane would be dead. Darren would more than likely be dead. Alan would be dead. Ronnie would be dead. Margaret would be dead. Other people in the community would be dead. Officers of the law would more than likely be dead if Jane Stafford hadn't pulled the trigger that night. And I invite you guys to think about what would have happened if it had been the other way around. If Billy had just shot Jane, he would have been given low priority. He would have been given manslaughter charges. Oh, well, I didn't premeditate it. It just happened. So he would have been given manslaughter charges. And this would have probably kept women's rights movements, and also the battered wife syndrome defense. This would have kept this probably out of the public eye for another, who knows, 10, 20 years, guys. We wouldn't have advanced as far as we did, as fast as we did, if it hadn't have been for Jane Hurshman. So whether you agree with what she did or don't agree with what she did, she made a lot of changes in this world. She thrust spousal abuse. I'm calling it spousal abuse because we know that women can also abuse men. So she pushed spousal abuse and familial abuse really into the public eye. She got it talked about. She got it recognized. She got it raised from in the court system from a low priority to a high priority, and something that needed to be prosecuted and needed to have steeper penalties, fines, jail time. She got it raised to that. She also forced the public to look at the consequences of what abuse can do to a person, can do to a family, how it can drive you to the breaking point. It was Jane's case that forced that into this. And like I said, she was doing what she had to do to survive Billy. I feel if Jane hadn't killed him, he would have definitely killed her and a number of other people too. So I think that Jane was doing what she had to do and what she felt was right at that time. She saved lives, guys. Not only did she probably save the lives of officers, Margaret, possibly Roger, Ronnie, Alan, Darren, herself, she saved other women's lives too by counseling them, by speaking about the abuse, by making them not feel alone in horrible situations, by talking them down from wanting to commit suicide like after they had been abused, by advising them, by telling them there were women's shelters, by getting that out in the open. Jane helped people and saved lives doing that as well. It's because of Jane. Sorry. It's because of Jane that spousal abuse was brought to the public eye, like I've said, and no longer kept in the shadows to be endured until death, basically. In a lot of circumstances or murder of that person, it wasn't to be kept in the shadows anymore. It's because of Jane that more funding was allotted to shelters and transition houses, and many, many, many more were built. That changes were made to how incarcerated women were treated are also due to Jane. It's because of Jane that spousal abuse was no longer treated as a low priority, like I just said, but was given more urgency in the courts and more prosecutions were given out. It's actually heavily prosecuted now, whereas prior to 82, it was not. It's because of Jane that the self-defense laws were changed in 1990 in Canada to include allowing battered women's syndrome or battered wife syndrome as a defense, as part of the self-defense defense. It's weird to say defense so often. Women in Canada owe a lot to Jane. Whether or not you agree with what she did change how people thought, looked at, talked about, acted around the issue of spousal abuse. She helped to bring it into the public light. And, you know, without Jane, who's to say when it finally would have been brought into the public life? Who's to say when we would actually have started to take notice of this, when spousal abuse was actually prosecuted? Who's to say when that would have happened if we hadn't have had Jane Stafford and if she hadn't have done what she did? So what do you guys think? Like I said before, do you think Jane was justified in what she did? Do you think Billy would have killed her anyway and other people if she hadn't have pulled the trigger? Do you think that any of these changes would have occurred if Jane hadn't had pulled the trigger? Do you think it would have taken many, many more years? I'm sure they would have occurred at some point in time, guys. Although who's to say if it would have been 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years later? It's because of her they occurred relatively faster than they do in some nations. Do you guys believe she committed suicide? Or do you believe Jane herself was murdered? If she was murdered, who did do it? Was it somebody that was affiliated with Billy? I mean, he did have some actual friends. Do you think that it could have been someone getting revenge for him? Could it have been an angry male, mad because this stuff was now all out in the open and they couldn't do what they felt like doing? That women were... that they were mad that women to them in their minds were property. And this woman was saying, no, women are not property. We're our own people in our own rights with our own points of view. Do you think it could have been somebody affiliated with Billy? Could it have been somebody that was just an angry male? Could it have been somebody that just didn't like the way that she brought everything out into the public? Could it have been somebody involved with Margaret Georgie? Could it have been somebody involved with Billy's family? If you believe she was murdered, I, for one, do not believe she was murdered. But if you guys do believe she was murdered, why do you believe she was murdered? And who do you guys think did it? And like I said before, if Jane hadn't done what she did, how do you think the law would look like now? Do you think there would be a battered woman's or battered, it should be battered spouse syndrome. Do you believe that there would have been a battered woman or battered wife syndrome if it hadn't have been for Jane? Do you think that would have ever been an addendum to the defense of self-defense? Let me know, guys. Let me know what you think. This is a really polarizing case. I'm thankful that you guys stayed with me. And like I said, next week, I'm hoping to work on an American case. I'm not going to give you guys a lot of hints about it. It's going to have something to do with along the same veins of what we've been talking about. You know, Sherry Furtuck, Courtney Lake, Jane Hurshman. I know you guys are probably thinking of who it is right now. I did have this requested from one of my very first subscribers. I have another request, and I am going to do it on the July 4th week. I'm going to do Ted Bundy. It will be a two-parter, so I did make a promise, and I'm going to uphold this. And I've had another request for a doe case out of Pennsylvania that I'm definitely going to get to. But for now, I feel like it's an okay time for us to take a break and venture into the American world, and then we'll come back to Canada after that. So I hope you guys have a really good week. I hope you guys found this interesting. If you did, please hit that old like button, subscribe if you haven't already, hit the notification bell, and leave me some comments, guys. I really want to know what you think on this one. So until next week, guys, bye.